participate in a group project. Group projects are the worst. If you guys get it, you're in school, you probably have a lot of group projects in middle school and high school. I hated group projects. There was always that one person who never contributed any work, never showed up to any of the meetings, never even replied to a text message or an email message, and yet they'd show up on the day of the presentation and expect to get a good grade. Or they'd sign their name to the final paper and expect to receive the same grade as everybody else. Now, I'm a bit of an overachiever, some might even say a perfectionist, and so naturally, I ended up doing most of the work when it came to group projects. And here's the thing, my classmates knew this. They would specifically pick me to be in their group, not because I was popular, but because they knew that they would get an easy A if I was in their group leading the project. I'd do all the work, they would contribute nothing, and they'd still end up getting a good grade. In group projects, everyone gets the same grade, whether they have participated or not. Now, we're going to come back to this idea of a group project, so just kind of store that in the back of your minds. But let's kind of recap where we've been so far in this series on Jesus' parables. Well, for the past 4 weeks, we've looked at some of Jesus' most famous parables, and by now we've seen that the characters in his stories rarely do what we expect them to do. They act in surprising and unconventional ways. We learned about a bold and persistent widow, a woman who made enough bread to feed the entire county. We learned about a shepherd who went out after one lost sheep. We learned about a merchant who went all in to receive a valuable and rare pearl. And once again, this parable today reveals something unexpected about us, about people in general, but most importantly, about God. So as a reminder, there's kind of two guiding questions that are framing our thinking in this series. And the first is, what did these parables mean to Jesus' original hearers? What did they mean to a first century Jewish audience? And secondly, what do they mean to us today? How can they continue to apply to our lives now? Let's start by looking at this Pharisee. Now, those of us in the church, we tend to give the Pharisee a hard time, a bit of a bad rap. We call them hypocrites. We say that they were too rule-driven or legalistic. We even sing silly little songs about them like, I don't want to be a Pharisee, because they're not fair, you see. Did anyone sing that growing up? Just me? So the Pharisees are often the bad guys in a lot of Jesus' stories or the stories in the gospel. We tend to view them pretty negatively. We characterize Pharisees as mean or stuck in the mud, hypocritic know-it-alls. But Dr. Amy Jill Levine, who is both a New Testament scholar and a Jewish woman, she calls on us to check some of our stereotypes about Pharisees. Pharisees weren't all that bad. Paul, the apostle who wrote a good chunk of the New Testament, he was a Pharisee, and he claimed that title with pride. If you read in Acts chapter 5, you have this really interesting account of how Peter and John got arrested in the temple, and it was a Pharisee named Gamaliel who spoke up on their behalf and petitioned for their release. Dr. Levine writes that for the majority of Jesus' original audience, his Jewish audience, the Pharisees would have been respected teachers, those who not only walked the walk, but talked the talk as well. In fact, she claims that this Pharisee in Jesus' story was almost like a caricature, a humorous representation of what a Pharisee might be. The Pharisee, if a real Pharisee were hearing this story, for example, he might get a chuckle out of it and say, yeah, that's pretty ridiculous that Pharisee would pray like that. So in this parable, the Pharisee's problem wasn't that he did a lot of good things, fasted twice a week or tithed on everything he had, refrained from adultery. Those are all actually really good things. In the parable, the Pharisee's problem was that he judged the tax collector unfairly and negatively. He had no right to judge the attitude or heart or even the actions of this tax collector. I think that if we're honest with ourselves, we all have a tendency to do this. We all have a tendency to judge unfairly, to judge a book by its cover, as the saying goes. We are quick to make snap judgments about someone based on their first impression or our initial encounter with them. I learned a phrase a couple of years ago. In fact, I may have even learned it from one of you. I'm not sure where I picked it up. But it's really helped me refrain from making these snap, quick judgments. And the phrase is, assume positive intent. Assume that the other person has good motivations, pure motivations. They're not out to get us. A lot of times we jump to conclusions, we kind of get in our own heads and think, well, that person just has it out for me. They're just trying to be mean to me. But a lot of times that's not really the case. So before we can jump to those conclusions, we should assume positive intent. And then, perhaps if we get a chance to talk to them, we might say, hey, I know you probably didn't mean it like this, but here's how I took it, and it hurt me. But this gives them a chance to explain their behaviors or perhaps even apologize for what they said or did. Now, if the Pharisee in our story had assumed positive intent about this tax collector, he wouldn't have said, well, thank God I'm not like this tax collector over here. Instead, he might have said, I'm so glad that tax collector has come to the temple, has come to church today. I'm so glad that tax collector showed up to worship and pray. I hope that he gets what he needs from God right now. So that's kind of our first lesson from this parable. Assume positive intent instead of being so quick to judge. But then that takes us to the other person in the parable, the tax collector. Unlike the Pharisees, tax collectors were not well-respected members of their society. They were people who worked for the Roman government, people who worked for the enemy, the oppressors. They were notorious for being dishonest, for cheating people, for swindling people. They demanded huge amounts of money, and then they would take a little extra off the top for themselves and keep the profits for themselves. They were outsiders in their society. They weren't really liked by the Romans, and they weren't really liked by the Jews either. No one wanted to hang out with the tax collectors. But then Jesus comes along, and Jesus hangs out with the tax collectors. He eats in their home, he spends time with them. He allowed them to be a part of his inner circle. One of Jesus' disciples was a tax collector, Matthew, also called Levi. So in this parable, this tax collector does something that's really totally unexpected. He shows up to the temple. He shows up to the temple to pray. And this image would have been really unsettling for Jesus' original audience because they like to picture tax collectors as greedy and corrupt, evil people, not as pious people who went to church and prayed. They might have said, well, what's this traitor doing here in our church today? In fact, it seems like the tax collector, he recognizes this as well. Because instead of holding up his head, he hangs his head low. He can't even lift his eyes to heaven. He stands apart from the crowd. He might have feared that his fellow worshipers were going to shun him. Perhaps he even felt unworthy to be in the temple, to be in God's presence. Yet by all accounts, it seems like this tax collector is sincere. He is really seeking mercy from God. He really does want to get right with God. The listeners of Jesus' parable would have been forced to come to terms with this image of a tax collector who could be righteous. Now, what's really interesting about this parable is that it comes just one chapter before another story about a tax collector named Zacchaeus. We've all heard the song. I'm not going to sing it for you, but we know the song about the wee little man who climbed up in a sycamore tree just to catch a glimpse of Jesus, just to be able to lay eyes on this healer and teacher and rabbi. And when Jesus sees him, he does something so unexpected. He says, Zacchaeus, I'm going to come over to your house for dinner today. Just invites himself over to dinner. And Zacchaeus is so stunned by this that he does something totally unexpected as well. He says, look, Lord, I will give half my possessions to the poor. And if I have cheated anyone out of any money, I will repay them 4 times back what I owed them. This is totally unexpected behavior from a tax collector. And I think that this provides us with another really important lesson from Jesus' parable. It's not just enough to pray to God and ask for forgiveness and ask for mercy. We need to be willing to make some changes in our own lives as well. We need to be willing to change our bad behaviors. We need to be willing to make restitution, to repay those we have wronged or hurt. God will always forgive us. Yes, we believe that. but we also believe that we have a part to play in this as well. There needs to be some follow-through, some accountability, some action taken after God's forgiveness. We don't want to just pray for forgiveness and then go on our way, continuing to hurt people, continuing to harm them. Instead, the model of the tax collector, the model of a Christian is Zacchaeus, someone who changed both his heart and his life. So that kind of leads to the conclusion of the parable in Luke chapter 18, the point that Jesus is getting to. Now, as I was reading this week, Dr. Levine, she said that the meaning of this parable hangs on the interpretation of one small Greek word. The word is para, P-A-R-A, para or para. She writes that according to most translations today, Jesus ends this parable with an explanation. I tell you, this man went down to his home justified rather than the Pharisee. That's what we read in our scripture today. That's how most English Bibles translate that word para, as rather than. The Pharisee is, the tax collector is justified rather than the Pharisee. But if you were here on the very first week of the series, and I know it was cold, so a lot of people weren't here to hear the message, but we learned about the meaning of this prefix para. See, para means to come alongside, to set some things beside each other, to make a comparison. You know, think of parallel lines. Parallel lines are lines that run alongside each other. When you parallel park your car, you pull your car alongside the curb. These parables, these stories of Jesus, we're meant to take our lives and set them alongside the parables, compare our own lives to these stories. And so this word para, it really means to come alongside. Watch how that changes the translation in verse 14. I tell you, this man went down to his home justified alongside the other one. This is the real unexpected conclusion to the story. Both the Pharisee and the tax collector were given forgiveness. Both were shown grace and mercy. The moral of the story isn't that one went away righteous and the other one was a sinner, and even if we reverse those from the roles we typically expect, that's not the real conclusion. Jesus' message is that both are equally forgiven. Both have received grace. And Jesus' first listeners would have known this to be true, but they wouldn't have liked it. They knew that God is a generous God. They knew that there was enough grace to go around for both the Pharisee and the tax collector. And that's what they had a problem with. As Dr. Levine puts it, we see that divine grace cannot be limited. For to limit this grace would be to limit God. This unlimited generosity is something that many of us find problematic. We are quite happy when we are saved. We are less happy when that salvation is extended to people that we don't like. The lesson of this story is that all are equal before God, even those we hate or despise, even ourselves when we don't feel worthy to receive God's grace. So that brings me back to this idea of group projects and those frustrating people who don't pull their weight and get a good grade, even when I did all the work. But as we deal with frustrating people, we need to remember the 3 lessons from this parable. The first is to assume positive intent. Maybe that person was doing all they could to get by. Maybe they had a lot going on at home and it was just a struggle for them to participate. Maybe they didn't understand the material, but they were too embarrassed to ask for help. We should assume positive intent even when people are very frustrating. And the second thing is that we should forgive them, but that doesn't necessarily let them off the hook for next time, because forgiveness should lead to a change of behavior. Forgiveness should lead to action, a change of heart and of life. And then finally, we need to be okay with the fact that God's grace is given to everyone equally, even those we don't like, even those we disagree with, even those who don't pull their weight in the group project. We are all equally saved and forgiven by God. I mean, after all, we are in this group project together known as First United Methodist Church of Excelsior Springs. We're in this group project of bringing the kingdom of God to come here in Excelsior Springs as it is in heaven. Scouts and church members alike, we are all in this together. And in fact, that's really the point of communion as well. When we come to this sacrament, when we come to this table, we recognize that we are all equal before God. We are all just sinners saved by grace.